Today, I'm going to share 3 stories that really never should have happened. The events in these tales feel impossible. They defy everything we understand about mathematics and probability. Yet every one of them is completely true, which proves to us that extraordinary, highly improbable events can occur at any moment. Before we dive into today's stories, if you're someone who enjoys the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place because that's all we do here. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week, so if that appeals to you, the next time you're at the Like Button's house, go ahead and secretly swap out their spray deodorant for hairspray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Story 1. Around noon on October 21st, 1988, a man named Valentino sat at a cafe table, sipping coffee on a sidewalk in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The neighborhood was called Caballito, right in the heart of the city, densely populated with tall apartment buildings, shops and cafes packed with pedestrians and traffic. So it was often loud and chaotic, and today was no different. But despite the craziness around him, Valentino wanted to find a moment of peace as he had his coffee. He leaned back in his chair and looked up at the sky above all the urban noise, taking a deep, calming breath. As he did this, he saw a few birds fly by and smiled to himself watching them glide. Then he noticed something else, out of the corner of his eye. Just across the street, he saw a flash of something brown plummeting toward the ground in front of a tall apartment building. Valentino turned his attention to see what it was, but what he saw didn't make any sense. An elderly woman on the other side of the street had stopped on the sidewalk and was staring down at what looked like a pile of clothes at her feet. The brown thing that had caught Valentino's eye, which he still couldn't identify, lay just a few feet away from that pile in front of the woman. Then the old woman began screaming. That's when Valentino realized that what he thought was a pile of clothes was actually a person, a heap of a body on the ground. Another old woman, completely motionless. Shocked, he tried to piece together what had happened. Was that flash of brown the thing that fell and struck this woman, leaving her lifeless on the ground? As Valentino formulated theories, it seemed the entire bustling neighborhood also paused for a moment, everyone trying to understand the madness unfolding across the street. But that brief calm quickly dissolved, and the street descended into total chaos again. Bystanders and locals began shouting and rushing over to help the woman on the ground. Soon, that woman and the screaming one were surrounded by a huge crowd. Valentino felt deeply shaken. The thought that he might have witnessed a woman being struck by that brown object traumatized him. He didn't want to add to the pandemonium by running over, so he stayed at his cafe table with his coffee, watching the crowd grow. Finally, Valentino heard sirens. An ambulance was close, even though help arriving should have been a relief. Professionals would clear the crowd and handle the situation. He couldn't calm down. His heart raced, his pulse pounded, his stomach churned. He felt terrible, reliving the trauma over and over. As the ambulance came into view and parked, the crowd parted to let paramedics through. Valentino craned his neck to see what was happening. As he did, he spotted a middle-aged woman he didn't know crossing the street toward the scene, seemingly just curious. As she crossed, a city bus plowed directly into her, and she disappeared under its wheels. Valentino, his heart already pounding, shot to his feet. What is going on here? Screams erupted from others who had seen the same horror. His heart raced nonstop, sweat dripped down his back, and he felt almost dizzy with shock. He began staggering away from his table, looking frantically for someone to help him. His body couldn't handle what he'd witnessed. But no one came. There were too many other horrible things demanding attention, and Valentino having a panic attack was low on the priority list. As he fumbled around the cafe trying to get someone to calm him down, no one paid him any attention. Eventually, Valentino spiraled and fell to the ground. Once again, he found himself on his back staring up at the sky, watching birds fly by. What actually happened on that street in 1988 in Buenos Aires was so improbable it made newspapers worldwide. The first woman hit by the falling object, the flash of brown, died from the impact. The middle-aged woman who crossed the road to see what happened and was hit by the bus also died. Valentino, who witnessed everything, was so stunned and horrified that he suffered a heart attack and died on the way to the hospital. So 3 fatalities within minutes, all connected. All freak accidents that had to happen in succession to even occur. And it all started with that brown object plunging through the air. The thing that caught Valentino's eye. That brownish object turned out to be the 4th victim, a poodle named Khaki that had chased a ball straight off the balcony of its owner's 13th floor apartment. It's normal to long for a time when connection felt easy, and being close to people didn't take so much effort. Then you look at your life now and it feels different. Busier, more complicated. There are moments I think about, nothing big, just sitting with people I cared about, talking about nothing. At the time, those moments didn't feel important. But looking back, I'd tell that younger version of myself to cherish them as they happen because they don't last forever. Someday the relationships you have today may be the ones you wish you'd held onto tighter. Therapy can help you navigate life's changes and provide tools for what's next. Story 2 at 3:00 a.m. On Sunday, December 24th, 1967, 26-year-old Sammy Brown Jr. sped down Seal Road in Phoenix City, Alabama, with a police siren blaring right behind him. Sammy was in trouble. It was Christmas Eve, and he'd celebrated a little too hard, drinking way too much. He thought he'd be okay to drive home since he lived close by, but he'd been wrong and attracted a police officer who was now chasing him. Sammy knew he couldn't get caught. In addition to being very drunk, he didn't even have a driver's license, so he was driving 100 miles an hour to get away. But the cop was gaining on him, and up ahead he saw another problem, a car in his lane going the speed limit. If he didn't swerve around it, he'd smash into them. But this was a local 2-lane road, not a highway. Swerving meant entering the oncoming traffic lane. Sammy looked and didn't see any other cars, so he decided to go for it and pray he got lucky. He cut his wheel to swerve around the slower car. But Sammy was extremely drunk, being chased by a cop gaining on him, his anxiety spiking, going too fast. In that state, he misjudged the timing and clipped the back of the slower car. Metal crunched, both cars spun out, and then miraculously came to a stop. Inside his car, Sammy sat up and realized he was unhurt. He looked out and saw the other driver, a man in his 60s, slowly get out and walk to his bumper to inspect the damage. Despite his bad situation, Sammy had gotten very lucky. Not only was he alive, but the man he'd hit at nearly 100 mph also appeared to be alive and basically okay. Following the crash, Sammy faced charges for reckless driving and driving without a license. But amazingly, his lucky streak continued. He didn't serve any jail time, just paid a few fines, which meant he really didn't learn his lesson. Over a year later, on April 13th, 1969, Sammy once again spent all of Saturday night drinking. Around 1:30 a.m. Sunday morning, he got into that same car, still without a license, and sped down Seal Road again. Just like last time, he saw a car ahead going too slow and decided to go around it. This time, though, he wasn't being chased, so he was less frantic. He began changing lanes much earlier, giving himself more distance. When he moved into the opposing traffic lane, he didn't clip the car in front. For a split second, he felt a rush of satisfaction, more proof that he was incredibly lucky. But before he could get back into the correct lane, he rounded a curve and was blinded by a searing bright light, then a deafening bang. His car jerked to the side, spun violently, and finally stopped. Sammy sat there stunned, taking stock. Again, he'd survived a high-speed wreck. His neck ached from the shaking, but otherwise he was unhurt. He'd gotten lucky again. He climbed out, dizzy from the crash and the alcohol, and saw what had happened. Trying to avoid the car in his lane, he'd swerved into oncoming traffic and hit another car head-on. A car going the opposite direction. Both vehicles were completely destroyed, fronts smashed in. A miracle Sammy had walked away. He staggered over to the other car to check on the driver and possible passengers. When he looked inside, he couldn't believe what he saw. Another miraculous stroke of luck. Only this time it wasn't the good kind. Sammy had somehow managed to do something that should have been impossible. He had almost perfectly recreated the accident from a year earlier, same car, same road, same day of the week. Crashed for basically the same reasons. And when Sammy looked inside the car he'd hit head-on, he realized one more truly incredible coincidence. The driver was the same man from the year before. His name was Francis Patterson, 65 years old. He didn't even live in Phoenix City. It was a wild coincidence that twice, more than a year apart, Sammy had hit him while driving drunk on Seal Road. The only difference this second time, Francis died from the crash. Following the tragedy, Sammy Brown Jeter was charged with driving while intoxicated and involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 months in prison. Story 3. On a Sunday night in early 1805, a 13-year-old boy named Emile Deschamps sat at a table full of adults in a house in Orléans, France. Emile was supposed to be having dinner with the other boys at his boarding school across the city, but his aunt had picked him up as a surprise for a home-cooked meal. He knew why she was worried about him. His parents had sent him to this boarding school a few years ago, but he hated the city, and soon after arriving, his mother died. He'd had a difficult time adjusting, feeling lonely and isolated, and his aunt was aware of that. That night, Emile was grateful his aunt had included him in this dinner, but it was full of adults he didn't know and was incredibly boring. One of his aunt's middle-aged friends, a man named Monsieur de Fongibu, was rambling on about his military experience. Emile wasn't remotely interested, so he did what he always did, tuned the man out and let his mind wander. Emile had a big imagination and would often disappear into his thoughts, especially when lonely and sad at school. Soon he was pulled back to reality when his aunt set dessert down in the middle of the table. It was a brown-sauced, cake-like thing wrapped in a cloth, piping hot with steam rising off it. Emile stared, never having seen such a dessert. Then he heard a voice say, "Oh, it's plum pudding. Emile, you should try this." It was Monsieur de Fongibu smiling at him. He repeated that Emile really needed to try a slice. It was a wonderful traditional English dessert, absolutely delicious. Emile let his aunt cut him a slice, took a bite, and was glad he did. It was rich, sweet, and perfectly warm. One of the best desserts he'd ever had. After thanking the monsieur and his aunt, he went back to letting his mind wander, while the adults continued their boring conversation. Eventually, the guests left. Emile returned to his boarding school, soon forgetting the dinner, the pudding, and the monsieur. 10 years later, in the spring of 1815, Emile was 23 and living in Paris, about 80 miles from Orléans. He had fled Orléans as soon as he was old enough and had turned his big imagination into a blossoming career as a poet and playwright, writing about love, chaos, and life's mysteries. That day, Emile had been writing nonstop, lost track of time, and forgotten to eat. Suddenly, he felt ravenously hungry. He went out looking for food. So hungry that he didn't care where he went. Normally, he was picky, but today he just wanted food. He randomly chose a café and went inside. It was small with a few customers. He took a seat and a waitress handed him a menu. When he flipped it open, his eyes went straight to the dessert section. He saw plum pudding, the amazing English dessert he'd had a decade earlier at his aunt's dinner party. He hadn't had it since. 10 years. He had to have it again. He asked the waitress for a slice. She shook her head. "I'm sorry, but the last piece we had I just served to the gentleman over there. We don't have any more." The waitress saw how distraught Emile was. He really wanted that plum pudding. So she called out to the gentleman in the corner who had the last piece. "Would you mind sharing that last piece with this new guest? He wants some plum pudding." Emile looked around the waitress at the person she was speaking to. The man looked up. It was Monsieur de Fongibu, the same man from the dinner party 10 years earlier, who had encouraged Emile to eat plum pudding for the first and only time in his life up to that point. Same guy, and they weren't even Orléans. They were 80 miles away in Paris. Emile had chosen a random cafe he'd never been to before, saw plum pudding on the menu, and the same man was there. What were the odds? Emile said to the waitress, "Hold on, I know him." He got up and walked over to the monsieur, sat down, and they both marveled at the coincidence. 10 years later, eating plum pudding together again. For about 15 minutes they caught up on their lives, ate the plum pudding, then parted ways. 38 years later at 6 p.m. on a winter evening in 1853, Emile sat at a tea party in Paris, having a great time chatting with other guests. He'd been invited by a hostess who admired his work. Now in his 60s, Emile was well known, having published many plays, poems, and translations, and was friends with literary giants of France and Europe. He had made it. As he sat basking in the glory, a staff member brought in a platter of dessert. Emile saw what it was and knew he had to have some plum pudding. As the staff came over to serve him, he laughed and told the story of how he'd only had plum pudding twice in his life. At 13 and 23, and both times Monsieur de Fongibu had been present. A crazy coincidence. He described seeing the monsieur 10 years later in Paris, 38 years ago, the biggest coincidence of his life. He joked to the table, "Here I am about to eat plum pudding for the third time. We better be on the lookout for the Monsieur. He's bound to show up." Everyone laughed. Emile got his plate of plum pudding, scooped up a bite, and was about to eat it when the butler walked in and announced one more guest would be joining them. Who walked in? None other than Monsieur de Fongibu. Emile, about to bite the pudding, looked up and couldn't believe it. The man was ancient, hadn't been seen for 38 years, and the only other times were when Emile was eating plum pudding. For the third time, it was happening again. Unbelievable. How was he here at the exact moment? Emile stared at the Monsieur with absolute shock. The Monsieur, scanning the room, met Emile's eyes and looked totally confused. He saw the plum pudding, then turned around and walked away. It turned out he'd been invited to another party on the same floor and had mistakenly wandered into Emile's party at the exact moment Emile was being served plum pudding for the third time in his life. This was an astounding set of coincidences over 50 years. The odds of everything lining up so perfectly were staggering. Emile felt there had to be something more going on. It couldn't just be chance. He would recount the plum pudding and Monsieur de Fongibu's story many times to friends and eventually write about it in his memoir. Today, nearly 200 years later, Emile's account has been analyzed countless times by probability experts, scientists, and mathematicians from around the world. No one has a good answer for how this could have happened. Ultimately, Emile's story became the foundation for a famous philosophical concept pioneered by Carl Jung called synchronicity. The idea that some coincidences might not be random at all, but instead connected to a much larger meaning or purpose, even if we don't know what that is. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. Remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. If you're looking for a recommendation from me of one video worth your time, it's this one right here. Give it a watch. All right, until next time, see you.